Blomcast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Hello and welcome to the Blomcast, the podcast that looks at changing points in history. Today, well, it's sort of difficult. You live in a present when everything is being shaken up and there is no bigger changing point thinkable. But let us return to the past for a little bit, at least for part of this conversation. I'm really thrilled to welcome Sunil Amrith to the Blomcast. Sunil, welcome.
Thank you so much, Philip. I'm glad to be here.
Sunil, you are a young historical star. You've held the MacArthur Award, which is also known as the Genius Award. Hooray. And you are a professor of history at Yale. You've written some very thought-provoking and provocative books, which I want to take as the beginning of our conversation. And we have found that our work and our thinking possibly has some overlaps, which I'd also love to explore. The book that brings us together at the moment is The Burning Earth. Tell us just about the basic premise of this book. What is this book doing?
The Burning Earth really starts with the question that's on many of our minds, which is, how did we reach this point of catastrophic environmental crisis? And what the book seeks to do, I think, is rather than to chart a singular path to the climate crisis or the planetary crisis, to really show the entanglement of both different parts of the world, but also sort of different trajectories that have brought us here, ranging from a sort of longue durée history of food and food production and the quest for food, to perhaps more familiar stories of the environmental consequences of colonialism and the disproportionate impact that the consumption of a small elite, increasingly global elite, has had on where we are at this moment.
That makes it a very topical book, but it goes back some 500 years and it spends some very instructive time on the beautiful island of Madeira. Tell us how Madeira is important for the development of, shall we say, human civilization hubris? I mean, how do you talk about this idea, which fascinates you and fascinates me as well, that human beings, or a particular kind of human beings, thought they could liberate themselves from the laws of nature, from nature itself?
I mean, that is an idea I think that we're both interested in, and for me, it is the thing I kept coming back to, which is, from a certain perspective, the question is, how is that even possible? How does that idea emerge? And then even when you have that as a vision or as a sort of idyll, what kinds of technological and institutional developments then actually give certain people the power to really think that they are carrying out this process of detachment or liberation? Madeira is a very interesting inflection point. The historian Jason Moore, a Marxist environmental historian, spends a lot of time on Madeira in his own account of climate crisis or sort of ecological rift, as he calls it. And what's interesting about it is partly plantation production is not new. I mean, sugar has been produced on plantations for several centuries before that in the Mediterranean world. Partly what's new is the way sugar production in Madeira is financed. I mean, it's financed by increasingly distant investors for rapid gain without any sense of needing to sort of sustain this as a form of production for the long term.
So this is no longer a sort of traditional understanding of agriculture, where you have a field that you tend and you're responsible for it, and somehow you are its guardian as well as it gives you some product.
And it's what's very interesting is if you look at a century later, some of the early commentators on Brazil, which is of course also being opened up to sugar production at the same time, they say it in exactly those terms. I mean, there's an account from the middle of the 1600s where a Portuguese traveler is traveling through Brazil, and he says, these men don't care for the land because they don't expect to stay here. And so there is that idea, what we now think of as a commodity frontier, that when this is used up, you move on. You move on somewhere else. And as early as the 17th century, you have these very evocative descriptions of the ruins that are left behind.
That is very reminiscent of palm oil production today. That is very reminiscent of building factories in distant places where you don't care how the workers are treated and what effect it has on the environment where in situ. So this is, you sell us a historical story, but actually you're talking very much about structures that have survived and that somehow become very clear and very readable in Madeira in this early capitalist adventure.
I think that's right. And palm oil is an excellent example just to sort of remind us that this is unfolding as we speak. I mean, palm oil continues to be the primary driver of deforestation in Indonesia, which is home to some of the largest tropical forests in the world outside Amazonia. And so this is a story that really is, we're still in the midst of it. I grew up in Singapore, and the landscape of Malaysia, which is I know very well and I've known all my life. If you fly over Malaysia, you can see, of course, these sort of orderly rows of trees. It was rubber, now it's mostly palm. And of course, the clearing of the land for these plantations, and this again goes back to the early modern precedents, involved fire, involved some of the largest fires that some of the early witnesses to Madeira's transformation had ever seen. And of course, they described it as akin to Vesuvius. They described it as akin to epic literature.
So basically, the early investors come there, and they set the island on fire because whatever is there is not economically interesting. It's land for plantations, and only then will it become sort of a subject. Then it will become real land.
And some of the early investors, I think this is again something new, don't even go there, and they're pooling their investment from far away. And they are investing in this place that is out of sight. And of course, that too is a logic that is still very much with us.
I wonder, you just touched on that, but I do find that a personal connection, a personal motivation, a personal story is usually at the base of most scholarly fascinations. Where would you locate your academic fascination with environmental history in the light of your own history and upbringing?
I would say that my own history and upbringing helps me to explain to myself why actually, in some ways, my interest in environmental questions came quite late. Because I grew up in Singapore in the last couple of decades of the 20th century at a moment when Singapore was in the midst of its utter transformation by land reclamation, by technological development, by becoming a sort of center of the global financial industry. The first Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, said at the beginning of the century that he thought air conditioning was the most important invention of the 20th century. That was my world. My world was an urban world. It was a fast-growing world. It was a world that was really founded on the belief that technology could solve any problem. And I would say it took me some time to unlearn some of that.
What you describe about Singapore in the 1980s and 90s sounds to me like Amsterdam in the 1650s and 80s. That metropolis that is created out of nothing. There's a poor little place before that really interests nobody, that has never achieved anything. These emerging cities, these little capitalist miracles, they become sort of nodes of civilization, but when we look at this kind of history, what always fascinates me is to see how history has changed and how, from the history of kings and generals, we have looked at other groups. But then we have finally also arrived at situating human history in nature and seeing ourselves as one of the many actors in this great drama, which is, I think, the most exciting change of perspective. So from this kind of perspective of environmental history, what did these sudden blossomings or sudden eruptions mean?
What they meant was very large-scale transformation. And if I go back to one of my favorite works of environmental history, which was William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, showing how really Chicago through its magnetic force, reshapes the entire American Midwest. And I think even with an island city like Singapore, in a more archipelagic way, it is drawing in resources and thereby transforming forests, landscapes, hinterlands from really quite a sort of wide region. If you think about these cities and their use of water, um, that's maybe a visceral way in which they are literally sort of drawing from the earth from further and further away. And I think if we take an environmental history perspective, we see that these capitalist miracles, as you call them, have often an outsized effect on not just human beings, but on all forms of life.
Details that you cite there, they bring us to two things that are fascinating. One has fascinated you for a long time. You've written a book called Unruly Waters, in which you write about the relationship that civilizations have with water. The relationship of our civilization with water is about to be changed very profoundly. But the very important point that you made is that this water is not always a cooperative partner. It has its own logic, its own laws, and these, in fact, inflict human nature, not the other way around.
One of the things I really liked, Philip, about your previous book, Nature's Mutiny, is even the title itself. The idea of there being an agency to water, to rivers, to climate itself that interferes with the best laid plans. And of course, that tension becomes sharper the more confident states and elites become in their ability to control nature and their ability to subdue nature. And we end up with this sort of amnesia, so that every time there is a catastrophic flooding event, particularly in a wealthier part of the world, the question is, how could this have happened? We should have prevented it. And this is not to say that, unwise policy decisions have very often exacerbated the human impact of extreme weather events or of flooding. But there's also a logic in the way of thinking about that suggests, I mean, my late and much missed colleague Jim Scott has just come out with a new book called In Praise of Floods, in which he is trying to undo some of that mentality. Water behaves as water behaves. And despite our centuries, indeed millennia, of trying to engineer water to be more convenient, there are always limits to that. And I mean, that was certainly the big idea at the heart of the previous book of mine, Unruly Waters, which is that actually water has never really been conquered. And we see that in Pakistan in 2022 with these colossal floods, where some of the worst affected regions were actually the most intensively engineered. So that when certain limits or thresholds are exceeded, in fact, the harm that is caused is multiplied by our infrastructures rather than mitigated.
You describe this multiplication of human effects, and that brings me to the second topic that kicks off, because you say that there's this series of cities that blossom, and you see that this series speeds up with history. You have individual cities, city-states, which basically, by the way, also very heavily rely on water management. In China, in the Indus Valley, in Babylonia, they're all water management virtuosos. But, when you come into the 20th century, you see these cities popping up everywhere, as you said, from Chicago to Dubai. It seems to be that one of the greatest issues in our history and in our present is the question of acceleration. Historical acceleration, but also technological acceleration. An acceleration that goes much faster than our societies can digest it or learn to deal with it.
I think that's absolutely right, Philip. And we use this phrase, the great acceleration, to talk about just how much the middle of the 20th century after Second World War is a point of inflection. We see this in those famous hockey stick graphs where take an indicator you like, and there's this very sharp uptick. But then I think there's in fact a second phase of acceleration. Because if you look at that, 1950 as a turning point, well, initially it's mostly the industrialized world, the global north, the North Atlantic world, that is causing that uptick, except when it comes to population, but on most indicators of consumption, emissions, etc. Then what happens is at the very end of the 20th century, China first and foremost, but other parts of Southeast Asia and then India, their acceleration kicks in. And it kicks in at a moment where, in a sense, a kind of global acceleration or a planetary acceleration is already well underway. By the 1980s, you start to see the incontrovertible evidence of what impact this acceleration is having on the climate. And that's exactly the moment that the Asian acceleration really takes off. I think that helps to explain why in such a short period of 3 or 4 decades. I mean, I was at a talk just last night by the New York Times climate correspondent Max Barak, and he points out that half of the cumulative carbon emissions that human societies have ever produced have coincided with the 30 years of the COP meetings. And so I think acceleration is right, and acceleration, which now I think is on the technological front, speeding up even more with AI and with all of the technologies which even a few years ago seemed a little bit further away from us.
When you look, I mean, you are a longue durée historian. You like to look over the last 500 years. I mean, it seems to me, if you'd taken a farmer pretty much anywhere in the world and you'd put him to sleep with a magic potion somewhere in the year 1200, and you've woken him up and there's somewhere in the year 1900, he would have found his way perfectly all right on the farm. Very little would have changed. The same animals to tend, by and large the same produce with the same steps of work that need to be done, using more or less the same tools. It's before fertilizer really comes in, etc. Now, everything that I knew as a 18-year-old about communication technology today belongs in a museum. And that is, to me, one example of technological acceleration. That 700 years can be a much shorter time than perhaps 30 years can be in another time of technology acceleration, because simply you could no longer understand the world with the perspective of 1990 when you went into the street today. At the same time, we are animals that are sort of habituated to live in a certain environment with a certain information density, with a certain group density that has accompanied us for the last, shall we say, 10,000 years or so. How do these things go together?
Well, I think it's that collision that helps us to explain the feeling of disorientation that so many people have, that also helps us to explain the difficulty or even impossibility of political consensus and agreement around how we manage this acceleration, whether that is in the sphere of climate or in many other spaces. And then I think there's a sort of maybe a mid-range continuity, which again hasn't shifted all that much. I mean, if we think of the biggest risks that we face in the world today, yes, some of them would have been unimaginable in 1900, but others wouldn't. Global war, for example.
Ironically, we thought that belonged into a museum in the meantime.
That's right. And it's that reassertion of an old and fairly familiar form of geopolitics that in some level, there's some ways we can see that as the middle level. If we think of kind of long-term evolutionary processes at one level and the kind of massive acceleration of certain technologies, there are also, what we might mistakenly call age-old conflicts. Of course, these conflicts are shifting and evolving all the time, but nevertheless, if I think about how climate activists or environmental negotiators, they have been thinking about obstacles to climate progress. war wasn't really amongst the things that they thought about in the 1980s and 90s as perhaps sort of looming particularly large and wrecking every plan to reduce emissions. And yet, so I think in some ways we are both living in unprecedented times, no doubt about it. And in other ways, I think that these deep historical patterns that you and I are interested in, Philip, are far from irrelevant to understanding the world that we're in at the moment.
Well, they're terribly relevant, but people are. I mean, what I'm really interested in how we have created a world for ourselves that we can no longer feel at home in. And that these technologies simply, I mean, if you look at social media, develop much faster than our societies can understand them, embed them, legislate for them, do all those necessary, find rituals for them to become part of our societies. And there's a curious thing that it seems to me that sort of the capitalist thought that you are interested in and criticized so well and described so well, and the progressive enlightenment thought that has interested me for a long time come together in one interesting point, and that is that they both believe human beings are infinitely improvable and shapeable. And that is a capitalist idea as much as it is an enlightened and therefore, for instance, a socialist idea. We will create the ideal republic and then we will shape the people who can live in it. But this is why every utopia in the world has always failed, because it has never started with the people, but always with the abstract idea of what an abstract idea of justice would be. Don't we find at this moment in history that we are just as nature isn't infinitely exploitable and infinitely changeable, our nature is also not infinitely changeable to the needs of a market, an ideology, a political system, an economic reality?
I think we do. I confront this in some ways in a very domestic sense as a parent of two young children who are 11 and 7 years old. And I mean, thinking about what the screens are doing to that cognition is terrifying. I mean, I like what you said about the fact we've built a world we can no longer feel at home in. All of the studies about what social media does to levels of anxiety amongst young people around the world does make me feel that there are these big disconnects between the technological world that we built, a kind of world of endless consumption, and our capacities to be human within those constraints. And I think, in some ways, you're right. It's not just a capitalist idea, it's an Enlightenment idea. It's also a post colonial idea. I mean, if I look at the societies that I know best, I mean, that idea that every citizen can be reshaped is profoundly embedded in post-colonial India in a different way. I suppose it's embedded in Maoist China as well. And you can see this. And in some ways, I feel like, if anything, that idea is stronger in the global south, at least from a sort of idea that governments can continue to shape their citizens and sort of make them into particular kinds of productive beings. Whereas I think here in the global north, in the West, we see that increasingly it's tech companies that are aspiring to sort of reshape humanity in their own image and certainly to their own interests.
But this is a very interesting thing because it touches so much on historical experience. I mean, the whole dimension of post-colonial thinking is, of course, terribly important to the environmental debate. But at the same time, this difference in perspective and also difference in historical experience. I mean, we in the rich West were convinced that the state could do that until 2 world wars dented our confidence in the state. But of course, the experience of those world wars was very different in India and in China. It did not question the state, and it did not question its ideology in the same way.
If anything, you can see that the impact of the Second World War in India and in China in different ways it emboldens the state, in some ways even creates it, because that's what a lot of the new scholarship on the Second World War in India is showing, that because of the colossal human tragedy of the partition. In fact, for a long time, people had thought the Second World War didn't impact India very much. But in fact, that's not true. And so much of the apparatus of what becomes the post-colonial state is actually forged during the Second World War. So it has almost the opposite. It has an emboldening and enabling impact, when previously the British colonial state in India had been, had set its ambitions very, very low as far as, social intervention was concerned.
My wife's from New Zealand, and through her I know that for New Zealand, the First World War was a really crucial moment of national identity forming, simply because Anzac soldiers, so New Zealand and Australian soldiers, were used for the cruelest, most risky missions, and they were used as cannon fodder before the British soldiers were sent, and that created a huge sense of outrage among these soldiers, also of pride, but that became a huge moment of national identity forming. Did that have a similar effect for India?
I mean, Indian troops, we're seeing more and more, I think, just how important troops from across the colonial world, but particularly India in terms of numbers, were to both the First and the Second World Wars. It doesn't have the same galvanizing impact on national identity, I don't think, as it does in the New Zealand case. If anything, the wars are a little bit inconvenient in Indian national memory because the Indian troops were fighting for the British Empire. And so by the time you get to the 1940s, there is a slight discomfort, or at least an ambivalence, because there are other ways in which the post-independence military in India actually proudly claims continuity with the British Indian Army. You see this even at the rituals on the border between India and Pakistan at Wagah.
Yes, they're fantastic.
Exactly. And that's, in some ways, it's a profoundly...
That's sort of British Army plus Bollywood.
Exactly. That's right.
That's that. Listen, the last episode that I recorded was a conversation with Natalie Tocci, who is a Europe expert, and we were talking about something that is at the moment a lot subject of conversation over here, which is the simple idea of the end of the West. Now, in a Cold War sense, or perhaps in a bigger sense, that's sort of my question. I listened to a Russian journalist who said that what people are saying in Moscow at the moment is that what happened to us in 1989 is now happening to the West. The collapse of a system because, and his reasoning I thought was very interesting, he said the Soviet Union collapsed because nobody believed its ideology anymore. And they replaced the ruling ideology with another one, namely cynicism. Now, looking at the so-called West today, you see an awful lot of people who no longer believe in liberal democracy, who just no longer will take it, who no longer think it's the only or even the least worst system of government. And there's a lot of cynicism about when it comes to also those who then end up in political office, who obviously have no sense of a body politic anymore, of a public office. How mistaken do you think this analogy is? Analogies are always dangerous, but always very tempting.
It's a very interesting analogy, one I hadn't heard before. I think one part of it does ring true, which has to do with the question of belief. And I do think that the level of public investment in liberal democracy is faltering in most societies that we might have grouped together as the West. I suppose one thing one would say is the West was perhaps never as monolithic as either its champions or its critics would have had. What I expect we're seeing and will continue to see is a much more of a kind of divergent trajectories within the group of countries that we might have grouped together as the West. I do think that the geopolitics of the world are shifting, and that the kinds of defenses of liberal democracy that would have been prevalent even a decade ago, one hears not very much of it anymore.
But that's, to me, a really, really important thing, because you can say, okay, we've had a transatlantic split. And perhaps the United States, we're recording this at the beginning of April, are going their own way for a while or for very long. We don't know. It may all collapse tomorrow, but it may go on happily for the next 20 years. We will see. That leaves the traditional other countries of the West, namely Europe plus, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, perhaps Japan. There would be a few candidates for such an alliance. But what preoccupies me much more is not just a geopolitical rift, but indeed the question of whether we are seeing the bankruptcy of the ideas. We're living in countries where throughout democracy is seen to be failing, where other parties are privileged, where human rights are being questioned, where basically what we think as the founding ideas of a Western project, an Enlightenment project, a liberal project, are being questioned and are being actively dismantled, not just in the United States. So what about the end of the West?
I think it comes down to, what you just said, Philip. This may play itself out in a matter of months, or this may be a question of 20 years. I mean, I think some of this is a question of time. I think some of it is a question of how strong are the institutions which have been at the heart of that project. Universities perhaps sort of loom pretty large in that. I do think that whether there is any coherent future to whether we call it a liberal democratic project or a Western project, universities have played a pretty major role in that, not necessarily just because of what university academics have written and said and published, but because of the education that they provide to young people. Now, when I see the humanities coming under attack all over the world, but certainly in some of their traditional strongholds, that is when I think I might agree with you, and I might start to worry that some of the fundamental values, whether that has to do with the importance of critical thought, whether that has to do with the importance of cultural competence in a broad and a deep sense, if those start to be eroded, then I think that worries me in some sense in a more fundamental way than this or that party coming to power in different parts of the world. Another thing that interests me, of course, is how this is seen in the rest of the world, because I think there is some level of Schadenfreude or even celebration that you will see in many other parts of the world, that what has often been seen as a hypocritical liberal project, which has had a double standard, particularly when it comes to countries in the global south, in a sense seems to have met its end. But I don't think it's as simple as that, because if I think about, say, environmental activists in India, there are profoundly important alliances that they have always forged with others committed in the broadest possible sense to collective action and to democracy, both in the global north and in other parts of the global south. And I think that, the end of the West, if the end of the West means an emboldening of a much more authoritarian, bloc-like world, then this is also going to be profoundly to the detriment of many social and political movements and groups that may not see themselves as part of a Western tradition, and in some ways have perhaps even been antagonistic with it on certain points, but which nevertheless share a certain spirit of critical thinking, democracy, voice, all of which I worry for both in the West and outside it.
This was going to be my next question for you. How is the failure of this project being seen in the global south? And will it be seen as a failed historical experiment? At some point, people in the 20th and 21st centuries experimented with democracy. It was found not to work, and people have moved away from it again. But I'd also like to really get this back into the context of your own work, because we've only really touched on it. And you describe this sort of exemplaric case of Madeira, where the island is burnt down basically and converted into plantations, and they are being exploited until the soils are exhausted, and then the circus moves on. In this case, it then moves on into the Americas and the West Indies. And what's left is a devastated island and a devastated local culture. You're very interested in the workings of capitalism in this context. Now, we're learning interesting things about capitalism. We have learned through China that capitalism actually doesn't need democracy, that you can be perfectly capitalist and keep a perfectly open market without having a democratic government. We have seen in Western Europe, when I grew up, the attempt of democracy to tame capitalism, which led to a pretty interesting sort of social utopia that worked, at least for some people, for some decades. But the question is whether capitalism and democracy don't have fundamentally contradictory interests. And in this context, now that so many people are disillusioned with democracy, no longer think that their interests are represented by democracy. I mean, you see where this is going. You know these surveys where now 7 out of 10 people think that their children will not have it better than they did. When they know that social mobility is basically much reduced, and therefore it is no longer a question of how hard you try. And at the same time, this country is mushrooming more billionaires by the hour. That people feel disengaged from this system that is being presented to them as liberal democracy is not that difficult to understand.
I agree. And of course, again, we have historical precedents for it. But what is striking and frankly dismaying is that the people disillusioned with liberal democracy very often find themselves putting their trust in these billionaires who are offering an alternative way of governing and living in the world. And it is interesting that the critique of liberal democracy seems to me sort of many steps further along in the current moment than a critique of capitalism.
I'm always very skeptical about utopias, and I'm not interested in any utopia that starts with the assumption that everybody is of goodwill and is willing to bear hardship, to put together, or to bear even personal disadvantage. You have shown very sharply the contradictions of capitalism, the limitations, the destructive sides. But here's a discussion that I have time and time again and that really preoccupies me. And it's so strange, incidentally, in these Trumpian days to talk about the climate debate. It almost feels like the good old days, because the climate debate seems to have gone completely away. It no longer seems to feature in our world. But we live in capitalist societies, but it is no accident that we've had the rights revolutions, the civic revolutions that we've had, rights for women, minority protections, etc., in rich societies that were intensely capitalist. This has not happened in poor societies. And these rich societies that were based on economic growth, they have developed into pretty sophisticated democracies, but also the institutions of those democracies, from the judicial system to the parliament to regular elections, cost a lot of money. How do you disentangle that if you find that economic growth is also the noose that slowly strangles us? Because if an economic system grows by 3%, it will double in 10 years, and you can see where this is going, and it's not going to a good place. So how do you make the stability of a society possible while enacting a transformation?
I mean, I think in some ways, India has always been interesting to scholars of the 20th century because in some ways it is an exception. India has had, not exactly on the same trajectory, but multiple rights revolutions without the prosperity. or at least without the prosperity for most of the population until much later on. And that's always been a puzzle. I mean, that's been a very interesting question which theorists of democracy have asked. At the time of India's independence, there were many who thought India was just not ready for democracy, not fit for democracy. Democracy is not possible. And there's wonderful work by my colleague here, Rohit Dey, and the historian Ornit Shani, showing how quickly ordinary citizens in India came to be invested in those institutions. And so there it is true that the promise of growth, which was not always delivered, was always part of that process of opening up society and politics to formerly disadvantaged groups. Women, discriminated castes, those at the very bottom of the hierarchy. And in some sense, that's what the entire developmental state and developmental project was about. It took for granted your assumption, which I agree with, which is that some level of widening prosperity is a condition of possibility for greater social inclusion, for opening up rights. And so the question then is, what do we do when that growth itself is killing the planet? And of course, there are theorists of degrowth. I don't think they address your question. I don't think they have fully grappled with this question.
They work in communes. They work fantastically in communes where everybody is because they want to be there and they're willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. If we live in complex societies, which are very much marked by migration and therefore very much marked by very divergent ideas of what a good life is, then that kind of utopia cannot be imposed. That's my problem.
I've come from a very similar starting point in terms of, political outlook and political ethics. And I think it's an unsatisfactory answer to me, but in the end, I think that muddling through is probably the least worst option. It's not romantic to think about incremental changes. It's not headline grabbing to think about, what can we do to reduce food waste? But one of the most shocking things I learned when I was writing The Burning Earth is that if the emissions from food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter in the world after India, after China and the United States.
Wow.
So there are ways to continue to expand economic opportunities for people, which I think are essential to all of the institutions that certainly you and I still believe in, perhaps, Philip. But to mitigate in an accelerating way, to go back to acceleration, the way in which that is having a ruinous impact on the future livability of this planet. And you go back to this idea of yours that, we're building a planet we don't feel at home in. And maybe refocusing on that question, like what is a habitable city, or what is a habitable world?
I've got this curious idea. I'd still love to make a research project or a good film out of it. It's called Primate Politics. And the idea is, if you go to any zoo, we have got a very good idea what a species-appropriate environment looks like for penguins and for snakes and for lions. We have not much thought about what a species-appropriate environment for Homo sapiens would look like. And I would love to take the collective expertise of psychologists and environmental scientists and biologists and primatologists and see what kind of ape are we. What do we need to feel a little less fearful, to feel a little more generous, to feel basically okay, so that we can afford to be a bit more generous? My question is, are there objective conditions that can be created? Also, are they the same all over the world? But it seems to be a way of conceiving of societies that is, usually utopias are very much ideas-led and not research-led. And we know very little about the interesting primate Homo sapiens. I mean, you are, as you said, the father of 2 young children. Look at how little we have known about how to educate our young. over centuries and millennia. We're not very familiar with us. And that brings me back also to our common preoccupation with this curious idea of human exceptionalism. That we are the creature that can tame the planet and make it our own. That, I think, is also psychologically quite a costly concept. I mean, power always invites the fear of losing it, and power always makes you lonely to some degree. I would be very interested to hear your response to my own grasping for what can come afterwards. Goes very much in the direction of Bruno Latour. This idea that instead of seeing ourselves as living on Earth, feet squarely planted in the dust and head up high in the clean air overlooking far horizons, we should think of ourselves as living in the critical zone, that tiny membrane of gas that surrounds this planet, in which there are myriad of actors, from microbes to us, to tectonic plates, which shape this environment. And we are one of the many. And we can only understand ourselves if we understand the infinite interconnections we have with the others. Is that... I mean, that sounds like an exciting philosophical project, but can that be more in our lifetime?
That's the question. I'm instinctively drawn to those ideas. And I think at some level there is no alternative for a kind of livable future than to tame that human exceptionalism and to start to see ourselves as really sharing this planet with many other living beings, that we all depend on each other. What that means in terms of practical politics, I think, is just a much more difficult set of debates. The Berggruen Institute in California is experimenting with this idea of what would an interspecies constitution look like. And that gets us to the question of, again, that's an old question of who speaks for whom.
Who gets to write the constitution, first of all?
The same comes into, the rights of nature movement. There is a question of representation. And then nature has, or particular natural bodies, a river, for example, has a guardian. The guardian represents the rights of the river in court. So then we're back to that sort of familiar language of institutions and the law. And I think that is where we're perhaps a little bit stuck in a circular thinking. And I'm looking forward, as you are, I think, to sort of where the new breakthroughs might come from in pushing us forward. Because I think a lot of us, at least from an academic or a philosophical point of view, understand that actually there is no future in imagining ourselves immune from the rest of this planet, because that's already very, very clear around us.
But I think, in terms of the debate, at least to you and me, one would say the other ideas simply no longer have any merit. Just as practically all natural sciences have gone away from looking at isolated phenomena and see that they can only understand these phenomena if they look at the whole system. From quantum physics to relativity to biology, it seems that the age of the heroic individual is simply over, and we need to look at the systems and how they work and how they are linked to other systems if we want to understand anything. We need to understand ourselves as symbiotic systems of tens of thousands of species of microbes living inside us, creating the hormones that create our mood, our intelligence, even our likelihood to develop illnesses, our personality. So, I mean, this idea of a networked existence seems quite clear and seems to be coming from various directions more or less at the same time. The question is just, in Trumpian times, how can that very nice academic debate become edge closer to a political reality, to a political realization? That means that perhaps We haven't lost our capitalist interest in making money, but we understand that we have to make our money in a closed system, that there are no externalities. Yes, that there are no externalities, that we have to look at the entire system. That doesn't mean that the intentions have to change. It just means that the context in which these intentions are enacted have to change. And I don't know whether that's possible.
Is that translational work, which is to say that how do we map our philosophical and scientific understandings of our networked existence into our self-consciousness, our political consciousness, into our values? How do we go back to some of the foundational ideas, whether they're liberal or they're anti-colonial ideas like freedom, with that new perspective in mind, which is something Latour was thinking about towards the end of his life, I think. And I think only by translating that into a political language that is somewhat more familiar or that is somewhat more moldable by a large number of people can we maybe hope to make a dent in a new way of being, a new way of thinking.
You are aware not only of the Western way of approaching the world and its economy, and also, of course, and I'm sorry to introduce this rather hackneyed word, but I don't know a better one, it's narratives. We consist of our stories, our moral reflexes consist of our stories, our ideas of who we are consist of them. Now, if the narrative of human mastery of the earth has to come to its end because its real world consequences are simply becoming too brutal, that has a lot to do with our using fossil fuels so explosively that all of a sudden our stupidity has real impact. If this narrative is coming to an end, obviously nobody can invent a synthetic, nice story for people to live by and to understand themselves. Where do you think are perhaps even candidates for narratives that can be revived, that are much older, that can be built upon, that can be transformed into something that carry us through into a new era of self-understanding? I mean, this sounds a bit esoteric. I don't mean that esoterically at all. But we do need a new kind of self-understanding that gets away from this old Western idea of humans versus nature.
I mean, I think we can find very deeply embedded narratives in any culture that I have any familiarity with. And I don't even think it's a sort of West and non-West dichotomy that we need to make there. I mean, if we look at most Western societies, they have within themselves other ways of imagining the human place in nature. I mean, yes, those ways might have been marginalized, certainly over the last 2 years, but they were there and they're still there, I think. And so I think a lot of environmental thinkers and theorists have gone back to various indigenous traditions, and I think that there is much that is valuable there, but I also wouldn't want to sort of elevate or valorize particular traditions as the source of these answers, partly because, the world has changed so vertiginously that I think that really the new narrative will also have to be something of a mosaic that may be drawing lots of different places.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because on the one hand, I think indigenous knowledge is something very important for us to learn from. Also, the metaphorical systems of that indigenous knowledge is very important. But I have a feeling that well-meaning people tend to forget one of the constants of human life, which is simply human stupidity, which applies to all human beings, even those who are not living in westernized societies. And we mustn't forget that many indigenous civilizations also damaged their own nature, but they just couldn't do it at a very large scale, so it never became a very big problem. But romanticizing solutions can also be a difficult, I mean, it also comes back to ultimately a very colonial idea of the noble savage who is not yet tainted by civilization.
And I think there's always been a strand of that in the global environmental movement. It's one that I'm quite suspicious of, which is not to say that I don't think there is much of profound and universal value in multiple traditions of thought around the world. But what I think we need now is not actually it's too late to recover a cosmology and a worldview that pertains to a world that no longer exists. What I think we need to do is to find seeds of inspiration and of compelling narratives in multiple traditions that might actually point us forward.
Are you hopeful that your children will grow up with these stories? We'll have something to do with that, of course.
I do maintain, as we all do, I think, while I live in a horror show of the daily news feed, I do continue to be hopeful that that level of change, the most fundamental level of change that we can't reduce to policy prescriptions and we can't sort of, even include in, global agreements, that level of a shift in consciousness is happening. It may not be happening fast enough or far enough, but it is happening. And I can see that amongst the young generation now, just how profoundly conscious they are that the human exceptionalism story is dead.
Sunil, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much. And, well, perhaps there will be an episode 2 because there's so many questions I still need to ask. But for now, thank you so much for giving me your time. And there'll be a lot of very grateful and fascinated listeners listening to your perspective and your arguments. That was another episode of the Blomcast. Be sure to subscribe right now, down there. Thank you. That's fantastic. This channel is growing, and I'm looking forward to seeing you another time. For this time, Sunil Amrith, thank you very much.